Welcome to the narrative podcast of Untold Stories, a space where silence is broken, secrets are unearthed, and stories find their voice. I'm Dr. Crystal Ann England, therapist, storyteller, and guide for healing through truth. Through intimate conversations and courageous storytelling, to intergenerational wisdom, to identity, race, purpose, and power, this is a sacred space for the stories we were never taught to tell, but always needed to hear. Because healing begins when the story is spoken. Welcome. This is the narrative of Untold Stories podcast. My name is Dr. Crystal Ann England, and I am your host. And today I really just wanted to take some time to sit down with you guys and let you know what it was that really influenced me to create this podcast. You see, I come from a very, very large family. My mom is one of 15 children, that is. My dad is one of 6. My mom grew up in Berbice, Guyana, in South America, just above Brazil. And my dad grew up in Jamaica. A huge part of who I am is that I am a daughter of the diaspora. And there are so many parts and pieces that make up the story of who I am. And I remember as a child, my parents would often tell stories, specifically stories about who we are and what we come from. And ever since I was a child, I was always intrigued by these stories. The stories around identity, the stories around lessons for learning. And I will never forget one time I was in 8th grade. It was our 8th grade. It was one of our last days of school. And I was sitting on a desk, and all of my friends were playing and laughing and dancing. It was like the end of the year party. And I'm just observing. And my teacher walks over and she says, "Chris, I see that you like to observe. You're so observant. You're always watching and taking note and taking inventory in that little mind of yours. And I love that about you. Don't ever lose that." And it was so interesting because here I am all these years later, and I still remember that. I still remember that, the feeling that I had that she had even seen and noticed that part about me. Because I don't know that I ever noticed that part about myself. And so fast forward to when I got to college and I was deciding what I would be. The interesting thing is I always knew since I was a kid, I would say, I want to be a psychology doctor, right? I just loved the idea that human beings could study other human beings and find out why they do the things they do, what makes them drive their lives, what brings about moments of where they break, what brings about moments where they thrive, how is it that 2 siblings can come from the same mother and father, but can be so incredibly different. And so my mind was always interested in the inner workings of human beings and the stories that came with each one. And so you see, all along, I was a lover of stories and had no idea. And in fact, I came from a long line of storytellers. You see, I remember when I was in my 20s, my grandpa, we went to, oftentimes he would be at my aunt's house in Connecticut. They would spend some time in Guyana, and then they would spend time in Connecticut. And so at this particular time, my grandpa and my grandma were in Connecticut. And I think, don't let me lie, I think it was around maybe Thanksgiving time. And all the cousins and all the aunties and all the uncles, we were at my one aunt's house. And we were all sitting on the floor. And my grandpa was telling Brother and Nancy stories. And he was telling also stories of young, stories of old, stories of our family, stories of how we came to be, who we were. And I always listened so intently because I just wanted more. I just wanted more information. Who are we? Who are we? And as he spoke, I just remember feeling so much pride that this old man carried these incredible, valuable stories about who we were, where we came from, and lessons that we could learn through these stories, like the stories of Brother and Nancy. And for me, when I even think of my own children now, so much of what I do is sharing the stories of my experiences and the experiences of my parents or of my cousins or of my aunts with my children. And my kids love it, right? There's these stories that I tell my kids of when I was little, how my dad used to do some certain things with me, and they'll ask him about it, like, Papa, did you used to do that to mommy? Is that what you used to do? They get so excited to hear about these stories. And it's funny because sometimes I'll forget that I even ever told them those stories, and they'll come back and they'll tell me, Mommy, do you remember that time when you did this and Papa did that? And I'm like, I told you that when you were like 3. How do you remember? Well, you see, as kids, the one thing we do remember is we remember the stories. Sometimes when everything else fails, when everything else fades, when everything else disappears, the only thing that we have left are the stories that we were told about who we were. The stories that carry on our identities. And this project, the narrative of Untold Stories podcast, is so important to me because when I think about even what is happening in this country as we speak, the way that Black people are being erased from history books, the way that Indigenous people and their stories are being erased from history books, or the way that those stories are being retold with untruths. Well, truths that aren't ours, that don't belong to us, that we don't even know because, in fact, it's not actually the truth. It's someone else's truth. But remembering that truth isn't always true, because there are many times that sometimes we create, as humans, stories in our mind about the truth, all the while not giving voice to the actual people who endured the pain, the suffering, the journey. And so my podcast is about allowing voices that were told to be suppressed, stories that were told to be hidden, stories that were told that didn't happen. That's not how it went. For me to allow those stories to have a place, to have their time, because those are the stories I'm interested in. I'm interested in the stories that we don't hear, the stories that we were told to shh, 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 shh. Keep it to yourself. We don't talk about that in public. We don't air out our dirty laundry. You know, something that I've seen all too often, and I always say this, is that in therapy, as a therapist, I have been a therapist for almost 2 decades. And so much of what I see is majority of the time when we think about what keeps a family sick, what keeps a family in the midst of dysfunction, is when we have secrets, when we have a lack of opportunities to tell stories of the truth of what really happened. And when we allow for the members of a family to share the good, the bad, the ugly, the nasty, the shameful parts of the stories, that we allow then and only then for a family unit, a family system to begin to heal. But so long as there are untruths, so long as there are secrets that are being held in the unit, the family cannot be well. And this is also why I advocate so strongly for my clients to begin to embrace and honor their truth and really turn a corner on looking at the things that bring them shame and finding ways to find lessons and release that shame. You know, there are so many parts of even my story when I think about my life, mistakes I've made within relationships, within friendships, at work. And when I think about sometimes those moments, I feel a lot of shame about it. I go, oh, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I allowed that. I can't believe all the things that bring shame, right? And it is not until I release myself from the mistakes I've made, from the poor choices that I've made, that then I allow my story to have space and grace, and I give myself permission to then begin to heal. And something I always tell my clients is that people can only use your story against you when you are ashamed of your story. And the more that you sit with the truths of your story, and the more that you embrace and forgive yourself for maybe the role that you played in your own story of your life, the closer you get to living a life of freedom. Because freedom can only really be achieved when there is openness, when there are no shackles, and those secrets serve as shackles. Those lies that we tell ourselves because of the shame, they become shackles. And so the more that we are able to fully sit in our authentic truth about who we are. Let me tell you guys a little story. Something that used to bring me a lot of shame. A few years back, I took a job. And upon taking this job, I was promised a position that was never really mine. In fact, that position was already held by somebody else. But the word on the street was that this particular person who already held the position that was promised to me was going to hopefully be in some ways kind of pushed out. And at the time, now I look back on it and I think, what the hell was I thinking, right? Why would I take a job where someone else already has a position, the position is already filled, and I'm being promised someone else's job? Like, that is so shady. That is, in fact, it's so unkind. And it just, all of it just feels so yucky that I'm going in knowing that this other person has no idea that they're about to be pushed out to make room for me, right? Nonetheless, I wasn't thinking about this other person. I was simply thinking about myself. And in hindsight, again, as I say this, I feel a tremendous amount of shame for knowing that information and still haven't taken the job. So I took the job, went into the job, but the moment I got there, it became apparent that the people there did not want me there. I don't know, maybe they had heard things, or maybe they just were not ready to receive an outsider. I don't know, neither here nor there. All I can think about is my own part and purpose in that situation. And so long story short, the person did in fact get pushed out, and I was able to take on that role that I was initially promised. But within the role, a lot of things began to unravel. A lot of untruths, right, began to unravel. And something I always say is that when someone does something to someone else, you should never think that you are exempt. In fact, you should be expecting that the same thing that that person does to that person, that they can also do it to you. It might not be your time tomorrow or today, but eventually it will be your time, right? And so the same way that that person got pushed out, I, in many ways, in the end, got pushed out. And I felt so frustrated with myself that I allowed myself to be put in a situation where I wasn't thinking about this other person and their feelings. And then in the end, the very same thing that happened to them happened to me in different ways, but essentially it was the same thing. I got pushed out too. And I look back on that situation, and again, in a lot of aspects of that situation, I did not handle myself in a way that I'm proud of. I allowed that circumstance to almost influence me to show up in ways that weren't really who I was at my core. But I think sometimes that's what happens in life, is that when we make certain decisions and we're making decisions not from here, but simply from here, that we lose that humanity part, right? And so because I was thinking from a space of elevating my career and making more money, I wasn't thinking about another person. I wasn't thinking about how my choices were affecting this other person. And again, that situation, even as I talk about it, it makes me feel very ashamed. But as I have objectively looked through that situation, objectively looked at myself and the role that I played and the part that I played, the more that I allow myself to be honest about what happened, the less shame I have around it. And so today, all I can do is learn from my own story. All I can do is learn from the circumstances that brought me shame so that I don't make those same mistakes again. And the truth is, I'm not that same person. That person I was years ago, that person doesn't live here anymore. There are certain lessons that I've allowed myself to learn and that I have really tried to harness the positives that I did get out of that situation. And moving forward, I can be free of the shackles that once held me confined because of those mistakes that I've made. And this is the importance of telling our truth. And this is the importance of sharing our story. Because the more that I'm able to share my story of learning from my mistakes, of being objective about the person that I was when I've made certain mistakes and how I've grown, the more I allow myself freedom. And so, family, this podcast is about unlocking doors. It's about conversations with voices that you've never heard of before, stories that we were told to hide from, be ashamed of. But here in this place, we celebrate these stories. We celebrate the lessons that we've learned, and we remove those cloaks of shame and throw them. And we embrace fully the story of a person who is learning and growing and evolving, because this is what it's really all about, at least for me. And so I thank you for tuning in. And if any of this resonates with you, go ahead and share it. Family, I appreciate your time. Thank you. And as always, of course, you can like, share, subscribe, all the good things. Please stay tuned. I have some incredible, amazing guests coming up on the show, and you want to stick around and watch. Love your feedback. And family, if this resonates with you, please go ahead in the comments and tell me. When was a time that you had to look at yourself and release the shame of your past? How were you able to do that? How were you able to release yourself from the shackles of shame and move forward to begin to live a more authentic, more full, more free life? I can't wait to read your responses. Sending you so much love, family. My name is Dr. Crystal Ann England, and this is the narrative of Untold Stories podcast.